Hello, and welcome to Anchored Hope. My name is Melinda, and my goal is to help us set our hope on God as we read and understand more of His Word, the Bible. Last time, we had an introduction to the Bible as a whole, and today we're going to start with Genesis 1 and 2. If you haven't had a chance to read those yet, I encourage you to stop the recording and go read them, and then please do come back. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everything that has a beginning must have a cause, but the first cause cannot have a beginning. It must be eternal. God is the uncaused cause, the one who was before the beginning and who created everything that exists apart from himself. The ancient Hebrews were unanimous that the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. Jesus and the writers of the New Testament also referred to Moses as the author of these books. That would put the date of their writing about 1450 BC. As Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, they needed to understand the truth about how the world came about, how their own history had developed, and most importantly, who God was. They had spent several hundred years learning about all the Egyptian myths. Now they were learning about the true and living God. Moses doesn't give us all the details we might like to know, but he focuses on who is the creator and what did the creator do. In the beginning, God was already there, and at the very dawn of time, God created the heavens and the earth. The New Testament adds to this, telling us that the creation was accomplished through Jesus Christ. John 1:1-3 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." The New Testament also tells us that creation was not made of things that were visible. You can look that up in Hebrews 11:3. There are 4 words for created in these 2 chapters. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'll do my best with the pronunciation. The first is the Hebrew word bara, translated creation. It's used only of God creating something that did not exist before. In chapter 1, this word is used 3 times for God's creation of heaven and earth, God's creation of the sea creatures and birds, which were the first animal life, and God's creation of man in his image. In chapter 2, bara summarizes God's work in creating all of the heavens and earth. The second word is asa, which is to produce or make from pre-existing materials. This is used on most of the creation days here, for example, when God creates the sun, moon, and stars. The third word is yatsar, which means to fashion skillfully like a potter does with clay. This is used in chapter 2, where God is forming Adam from the dust of the earth, and also it references him using this as he forms the animals. The fourth word is bana, to build with careful planning. This is only used in chapter 2, verse 22, where it's talking about God building the woman Eve from the pieces that he took out of the side of Adam. So we can see a little bit about how God creates each thing by the word that is used to describe the action. Some scholars have suggested that the first 3 days seem to be God creating spaces, the earth, the skies, the sea, the land, and then the later 3 days seem to be God filling those spaces with the sun, moon, and stars, animals in sea and air, with land animals, and finally with humanity. We also see repeatedly in these chapters that God creates simply by his word. He speaks and it happens. He's not struggling to accomplish this big job, but God has the power to bring it about just by his words. From the very beginning, God is a God who speaks, who communicates what he wants to have happen, and who has the power to bring it about. So verse 1 tells us that God, bara, created something that was not there before, the heavens and the earth. And verse 2 tells us that it was formless and void. That doesn't mean that it had been destroyed somehow. It just didn't have its shape yet, and it wasn't full of life. But the Spirit of God was there. The Hebrew word translated moved or hovered in English is an active one, used of brooding, fluttering, or shaking. So the Spirit of God was active, ready to form the earth and fill it with living things. After God creates the heavens and the earth, the first thing he makes as he starts to bring it to life is light. Today, we don't know of any kind of light without the sun, moon, or stars. But this light, which God separates from the darkness, is not based on those. Those wouldn't be created until day 4. However, we are told much later in the Bible that when we're finally in heaven, once again, there will be light with no sun. Revelation 21:23 says, "And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb." At the end of verse 3, we read this phrase, "And there was evening and there was morning, the first day." We'll see the same phrase every day of creation. It seems pretty straightforward, but there have been literally millions of pages written about this. Does it mean literal days? Does it mean a time period? I'm not going to go into that discussion here because it could take years just to present both sides fairly. But I do want to point out one thing. There are godly Christians who take the Bible seriously who fall on both sides of this issue. If the idea of a young earth is hard for you to accept, there are plenty of Christians who agree with you. If the idea of an old earth is hard to accept, there are plenty of Christians who agree with you. It's good to pray, study, and seek to understand, but it's also okay if we don't understand something fully, especially not right away. God can lead you through the things that you do understand in His Word, and that may be enough for now. Sometimes we have to accept that we don't understand everything. Hopefully, you made time to read the rest of the 2 chapters, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but I would like to point out a few things. Both the vegetation and the animals were created to produce after their kinds. This means that while there can be significant mutations within a kind, they don't change from one kind to another. So you can start with one dog kind and develop everything from Chihuahuas to St. Bernards, but you don't start being a cat. There's been quite a bit of research into what these kinds might include. So if that's interesting to you, I encourage you to Google it. I think it's fascinating. I just don't have time for that right now. It's worth noticing that Moses does not give names to the sun and moon. He just calls them the greater light and the lesser light. This may be because there was so much mythology tied to the names of these objects in the ancient world. If he said God made Ra, they would most likely have thought of everything they knew about the Egyptian sun god. So any name he might have given them would have baggage, things that people would assume. So by just calling them the greater light and the lesser light, he may be trying to avoid that problem. Also notice that as God creates things, he keeps saying it is good. Creation in the beginning was all good. Going down to verse 26, we see God making something new. We go back to the word created, bara, when God creates man, and God says that this creation will be in his image. He then specifies 2 aspects of this image. Man will rule over all the creatures, and man will be created in 2 genders, male and female. This means that our maleness or femaleness is a significant way in which we reflect God's character. It's not an insignificant, culture-driven concept, but it's an important aspect of God's image and character in us. Reading this verse after we have read the New Testament, it's hard not to see the Trinity when we read, "Let us make," with a plural phrasing. But the early reader would not have understood it this way. They would have seen us as referring to either God speaking to angels or as a royal we, similar to how the Queen of England used to say we, referring to herself. After this, God gives them several commands: be fruitful and multiply, and subdue the earth and rule over it. This does not mean to destroy it, but to rule over it as a stewardship from God, to take care of it well as God would. And we see that God provides food for them. At this time, all the food was vegetarian for both humans and animals. Later, we'll see how meat was added to our diets. There are sharp-toothed animals today that still only eat vegetables, like the panda bear. And this verse tells us that in the beginning, all animals only ate vegetables, regardless of their tooth type. So now with the creation of man, God says that his creation is very good. On the 7th day, God rested. It's not that he was tired, but more like when you make something that you're very happy with and you sit back and you say, "Oh, that's really good." So God rested, and he blessed that day, and he set it apart for man to also rest. If you think about the cycles of days we have on Earth, we have a year that's based on the sun. We have a month that's based roughly on the moon with a few adjustments. But almost every culture in the world also has a 7-day week. There's no astronomical way to derive this. The 7-day week comes from the Bible. God created a 7-day cycle of work and rest. Chapter 2, verse 4 contains a phrase which will be repeated many times in Genesis. This is the account of. Here it's the account of the heavens and the earth. Later there will be the account of Adam, the account of Noah, the account of Abraham, etc. There are two main ways that scholars have interpreted this phrase. The first is as a summary after the fact. This was the account of how the heavens and earth were created. This was the account of Adam's life. The other way is as a preview of the next section. So basically meaning this is what became of the heavens and the earth after they were created. Or this is what became of Adam's line after he died. So we'll continue to point out these divisions, this phrase, because it does divide Genesis neatly into sections for us. The whole first chapter was Moses' overall summary of what God did. Now, in chapter 2, verse 5, he gets much more specific about the creation of humanity. There are some parts of chapter 2 that we have to think through to figure out how they fit with chapter 1. They're not really contradictory, they're complementary, they're side by side, but they emphasize different things. The first of these apparent contradictions occurs right away in verse 5. Some English translations appear to have a contradiction when they say that there were no plants before God created man. However, in chapter 1, it said that the plants were created on day 3. The English Standard Version has a clearer translation of the Hebrew when it says there were no plants of the field. You can check a reference like Blue Letter Bible if you want to see that Hebrew phrase. That it really is there. I checked. But once we see this, then we can see that it seems to be referring to agriculture. So not just wild plants of the forest, but there were no plants of the field. There was no agriculture. There are no cultivated plants because there wasn't a man to work the earth and cultivate those fields. But God cared for the man by making a garden. And in that garden, he put all of the trees and plants that were good for food without requiring that cultivation. Every kind of tree for food and for beauty. And God put the man in that garden. Chapter 2, verses 10 to 14 list 4 different rivers. We don't know exactly where the rivers are, though we have some ideas. We will see in chapters 6 to 9 that the world was destroyed by a flood, and at the end of the flood, it says that the mountains were pushed up. So it's possible that these rivers were named after rivers that the people getting off of the ark had previously known, in the same way that you would have New York in the United States named after York, England. But it also could be that these rivers were in a similar location as well. Moving down to verse 16, we see that God gave the man a considerable amount of freedom to do almost anything. But God did give him one commandment: do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It doesn't say don't get knowledge. They already had knowledge of good, since everything that was created was good. But by their deliberate disobedience, what they gained was a knowledge of evil. And God's commandment, as usual, was for their good, to protect them, but he also gave them the freedom to choose to obey or not. It seems that God does not want a robotic obedience, but he wants our hearts to follow him willingly. In verse 18 of chapter 2, we see that God knew that it was not good for man to be alone. It appears that perhaps Adam did not know that. In the ancient world, giving something a name was a sign of authority over that. So the man had the authority to decide what the animals would be called. And as he did so, there was no creature that corresponded to the man himself. So after seeing and naming all the animals, Adam knows this. And when God brings the woman to the man, Adam says, finally, here's someone that's like me. And as is often the case when God gives a blessing, God makes the man go to sleep while God does his work. This gift was a work of God and not a work of man. In verse 20, we see the phrase suitable helper used of the woman. Many have felt that this means that the woman is inferior to the man, but it's worth pointing out that this word for helper is used of God 14 times in the Old Testament. 4 of those times are in the writings of Moses. It's not a servant from a lowly place, but it's one who has something that the other one needs, one who gives out of their own ability to give. It's not a bad thing to have our role in life compared to God's. Of course, we don't want to take that too far, but also we need to not lose sight of the fact that this helper role is very significant. When God brings Eve to Adam, starting in verse 22, we see that the man recognizes that she is closely related to himself, not inferior, not underneath him, but bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. And the idea of marriage starts here as well. God gave one woman to one man, and they become one flesh. And in ways that we don't fully understand, this is part of the image of God in us, that the two become one. And lastly, in verse 25, we see that though they did not have clothing, they were naked, they were not ashamed in front of each other. Shame is a consequence of sin, and they had no sin, so they had no shame. All right, that's all I have for today. I will try to get the next video out next week. If you can, try to read Genesis 3 to 5. And just like last time, write down any questions that you have and write down any verses that really stand out to you. Either if they're convicting or they tell you something about God, or you just find them interesting, write them down. And if you have any questions about chapters 1 and 2, feel free to put them in the comments. I would love to have these videos be a discussion starter and not just a lecture. And I will see you hopefully next week. Hopefully it will go better than the previous week when I was sick and out of town. But I'm looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.